And so there's an interconnectedness that's inherent in the picture. And now when you think about that and you start realizing that your timeline, your story is one that relates to other stories, right? Every character in your story, all the people that you know, they have their own stories, their own timelines, their own narratives, right? That are connected to you just as yours are connected to them. And the synchronicities that are really the touch points when these different threads in the tapestry of reality, right, are coming together.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I am your host, Bernie Beitman, psychiatrist and synchronicity student. And it's really fun to do this stuff. You can look at my book, Meaningful Coincidences, How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen, and really help us get the ideas out of synchronicity, serendipity, and meaningful coincidences if you subscribe and send some comments to me. It's fun to respond and have dialogues with people who watch these videos. Today, we're doing something a little different. Talking to a man who's written a novel. It's the first time that's relevant to what we're talking about here. And let me start with this. Synchronicity stories are based on a limited number of patterns with many variations. Being in the right place at the right time, for example, receiving needed information without doing anything. The person that's right shows up in your life at just the right time. These are examples of coincidence archetypes, those abstract filters through which stories manifest themselves. So I outlined a protocol for examining hundreds of coincidence stories from my website, the Coincidence Project website, and from guest stories on this podcast. We collected them. We have about 750 of them now. We needed someone who knew AI and who would find this question of interest. I tried several times with different people until Jeff Dunne appeared in my consciousness. And here he is.
Hello, Bernie. And everybody.
He is helping us to answer this question. He started with this. We won't get into it much today, but helping us answer this question: can artificial intelligence help us find patterns in coincidence stories that the human mind misses? That's the question. And he started on that. Jeffrey Dunne is president of ICRL, an organization established to continue the research of the effects of consciousness on physical systems, which were begun at Princeton University from 1979 until 2007. Beyond exploring the nature of consciousness and several decades of research at the Johns Hopkins University in fields ranging from acoustics to data science and AI, Jeff is also an award-winning playwright and author. Through his novel, Nexus, that's, I'm just finishing reading this one. It's really a lot of fun to read this, and it's about two different Earths, one EARTH and the other AERTH, that were split apart, kind of like two lovers in the old Platonic idea. Were split apart, but now they're coming together, maybe clashing, maybe destroying one or the other. Well, you'll see what happens. He weaves in the concept of syntropy and the implications of the nature of consciousness to address the challenges humanity is facing, highlighting a path to navigate towards a healthier, sustainable future, much like the Coincidence Project has in mind. So, Jeff, I'm really so happy that we have met and that you have started looking at this question of patterns within coincidence stories and across coincidence stories. But first, please tell us a coincidence story.
Well, the obvious coincidence story you already hit, which is how we even came together through this incredibly coincidental union of projects in terms of the AI. But one of them that actually has been uh, quite profound over the last couple of months was we bought a house recently. A property really was the focus of this, and our intent as in buying it was really to have a place to get away, to shift from a suburban environment, which we've been in for the last 25 years, into something that was a little bit more in touch with nature, and recognizing that it was to be a resource for the International Consciousness Research Laboratories. We started by looking at some communities in North Carolina, ended up, because of price and convenience and distance, shifting up into a little bit further north into Virginia, and found a place that was really wonderful. At no time had I thought about, like, if I were trying to set up some resource for consciousness studies, where would be the right place to do this? That wasn't that wasn't the question that I was asking, at least consciously. I just wanted someplace that was really pretty. So we ended up getting it. And then what I have discovered over the last maybe 6 months or something like that, maybe not even 4 months, is that unknowingly I've landed essentially in sort of this mecca of different organizations and efforts at all scopes that are all basically right where I bought this place. I couldn't have planned it better than that. If I had gone around the country looking for where would I want to be, what would have been the ideal place to locate this new ICRL facility, this is the place I would have picked. And it just happened to have been the way that it worked out, not knowing, which to me is an incredible synchronicity. Uh, the odds that happened to have been the place that was not so in the same location as to be essentially an alternative for people, and yet close enough to build effective collaborations. To me, that's a sign that things are moving in the direction that they're supposed to move, which is a tie between the synchronicities and an idea of syntropy, which you mentioned when you mentioned Nexus. That's sort of a core theme of that book as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, so the part of that is there are 4 organizations in the Charlottesville area, and you're about an hour from us at your new place, that are interested in various ways in the study of consciousness. One of them being the Division of Perceptual Studies here in Charlottesville, which I am connected with, and a couple of others around the Monroe Institute, the Synchronicity Foundation, and ARE in Virginia Beach, and which is 3 hours away. So the others a little closer. So yeah, this you landed in the right place, and you didn't describe the coincidences that got you the house, and we don't have to, but there's a
Yeah.
variety of things that got you the house or that property. And we had lunch with several other colleagues of mine, friends of mine, that showed Jeff that we got some action going on here that's even more, because we're starting to do something, as you have described, and we're talking about doing patterns in coincidence stories. So why don't you tell us what you mean by syntropy and how it might relate to synchronicity?
Yeah, great question. I came across the term syntropy maybe 7 or 8 years ago, something on the order of a decade ago. I had, throughout my life, been familiar with the idea that there was this future causal concept. Teleology is the word that I had used originally, and I know you're familiar with that because we'd mentioned it as well. This idea that there are things not only in the past that motivate you to make the decisions that you make, but there are things in the future purposes towards which you really have this intention, and that are tying together aspects of your world, your life with other lives and worlds, people who you may not have met yet, but who are going to be important in your life. About 6 or 7 years ago or something like that, I had read this book called Syntropy, the Spirit of Love, in which somebody had taken a very scientific approach to this idea of syntropy. Syntropy is the complement of entropy, entropy being that sort of driving aspect of the physical representation of the world, of the laws of physics, that we go from an ordered state to a disordered state, to losing cohesion. That's why they say that once you pour your milk into your coffee, you're not getting the milk back out of the coffee, right? This is an entropy thing. The equations that govern all of this come out of standard equations of physics, and they predict, those equations predict that energy and information are going to flow forward in time. That's your entropy connection. There's a second set of solutions to those equations that were not really taken it seriously at the time that a lot of the work was being done, but they're equally valid. They come from a negative sign under square root. If you're into mathematics, you appreciate what that kind of does to people, especially back then. Like, no, that's not real. That's a mathematical artifact. And particularly because those solutions said that information and energy will flow backward in time. And mainstream science was like, that's a mathematical artifact. Let's not take that seriously. But then as technology evolved and more experiments were being done, we were able to show, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have ignored that one. That has a real effect. In addition to which, the idea, that complementary idea, that we are not just cause-driven, but also purpose-driven, right, explains some things that science wasn't doing a great job at, such as, for example, life and us, right? Because from an entropic perspective, we should evolve into amoebas. Amoebas should not evolve into us, and yet here we are, right? But when you partner entropy and syntropy together, you get a much more workable model, a much more comprehensive model. Anyway, the book came about as a result of this idea of syntropy is that we have future purposes that call us forward the same way that we have past causes that push us forward, and that this is kind of an entwining property, right? If you think about the implications that there's future causes, if you will, or future purposes, well, what does that mean except that we have at some level some relationship to each other, some connection to each other? In other words, we're interdependent, we're interconnected. We are indeed part of a larger system that is working as a whole, not individual things that are off doing their own story independent of everybody and everything else around us, right? So this is an opportunity for science and spirituality to really come together. Very important stuff. And I was very thrilled at the idea of syntropy, the way that it was described, its foundation in mathematics and the laws of physics and such. And I had told the author of the other book, Syntropy, the Spirit of Love, I was talking to one of the two authors, Ulysses de Corpo, and I said, this is great, but what you should do is you should write this in a non-scientific way just to help get the idea out there so that people don't feel like they have to have a background in science, mainstream science or any other kind of science to appreciate it. And he said, yeah, that's a great idea, but I don't write that kind of stuff. You should do it. And I was like, okay, challenge accepted.
And so you have, and this is the result, Nexus, which refers to the clash of the two variations on Earth. And, I as I listen to you talk about syntropy, Jeff, I think about the people who have synchronistically come into my life. And I think about how other people think that maybe a deceased parent or some guardian angel has brought them together. We want to have an explanation. It's a little bit like ancient Greeks thought that the sun was pulled by a chariot by Apollo across the sky. It was come up with some kind of explanation for it. But I hear when you're talking about syntropy, you're talking about retrocausation, causation moving backwards in time, and then probably that the effect of that causation backwards affects the purpose. So there continues to be a feedback loop between the purpose and the effect on the present. Well, as I think about that, this becomes a more, let me say, scientific way of thinking about how people come together, like you and I have met, that things worked right for me to be involved with David Lorimer, but we won't go through the details of it, but one guy was able to put us together who knew both of us and saw the potential. Well, how all that happens is part of the fun of this. But once you start thinking about retrocausation, rather than some kind of entity in the psychosphere around us, in the mental atmosphere around us, influencing us, it becomes a different kind of way of thinking about it. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I agree. And, one of the things that was discovered and replicated consistently in research done between the sort of late 1970s and the mid 2000s, or actually, yeah, mid 2000s, was looking at experiments that explored the relationship of causality and time. And, can we affect things that through an intention that are happening now? Okay. Yes, turns out you can. Can we do that for something that's going to happen a week, a month, a year from now? Turns out, yes, you can do that. What about a week, a month, a year ago? It turns out, yes, you can do that as well. And so it really leads you to start asking the question, what is the nature of time? And is, for example, time something that is truly external to us as conscious beings? Or is time an organizational principle that we are using to craft the story that is our lives and our experiences in a way that we can relate them to ourselves and relate them to others, so that we can, for example, have a conversation like we're having right now. And I can talk about, something that happened in the past, pardon me, like a conversation with David Lorimer said, there's this guy, Bernie, that you ought to talk to, versus something that is in the future, which is some point, whether that's a week, a month, a year from now, where you and I are sitting around some AI-enabled capability to better identify synchronicities, that was the reason that we came together. Which one was it? Well, how do you want to tell the story? And so I think that idea that time is much more fluid and flexible, it's part of what we're using to tell the story, not so much something that like a set of laws that we have to conform to, but rather a helpful guideline that helps us have those stories. So I do think there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to time and understanding, what are the synchronicities?
As one of the human beings wandering around, knowing that we have an hour to do this, the show, there's a certain way of structuring reality that time allows us. I don't know. Help me get past the fluidity of time when I see myself getting older. And because that's a linear thing from my experience and everybody else's experience. We get older, and the kids come up, and grandchildren come around. I mean, and dogs that live and die, and cats. There's this kind of this parabola of life, or you just come and you go.
Yeah.
And then there's this thing called the sun that comes up each morning and goes down at night, and it does that in a regular and predictable way. So those are pretty good markers of forward-moving time. How do you manage those two things?
Well, it's a very convenient convention, I would say, right? We kind of agree that anything that we look at in the moment of now, and we say, well, this is me. This is where I am in time and space. This is the Jeff. And I'm permitted to look at aspects of time, pardon me, aspects of Jeff that I would describe as being earlier in time, when I was smaller, when my back didn't hurt as much in the morning, as, you know, like, right, all those things. And I'm permitted to look back by convention and say that those are things in my past. That was the me of my past. And to a much less grand extent, I look forward. I can look forward in terms of perhaps dreams that I had. I'm willing to accept that maybe I've got a precognitive experience. I'm getting some kind of message from future me or future anything else, right? There's certainly lots and lots of evidence, documentation of people who have been getting information about things that are future events in the traditional things. But we tend not to allow ourselves to do that very much. We're taught that you're not permitted to do that. You're taught that you've got a particular timeline that you're allowed to look back at, and it starts with where you are now and going in that direction of how you describe things. But the lots of experiences and I don't want to say anecdotes, because it makes it sound, it almost makes it sound a little less than truth, but people relating experiences. For example, the perhaps the strongest one are people who have near-death experiences, who during the near-death experience they had the experience, and it all happened. Not it all happened in order. It simply all happened. There wasn't a time sequence to it. It wasn't until they got back from the near-death experience and started thinking about it, were they able to piece things into a time order, right? And in cases like that, you see that sort of convention of organizing things in time isn't convention. It's, you agree that you're going to say that event A happened before event B. If you want to say that the relationship between those is traditional forward time flowing causal, well, then you have to have been pulled out of the car before you were put in the ambulance, because it doesn't make sense to be put in the ambulance before you got pulled out of the car. Okay, so we've got this convention that this is the right way to tell our stories. But the idea that they all happen, or there's a lot of evidence that they all happen. I don't want to say at the same time.
They all happen and in a non-time linear time frame.
Exactly.
That's the near-death experience ideas. I'm gonna we could do this, and maybe we'll do it another time. Time is on my side. Yes,
built into the language. It is.
It's built into timely. And this is this is very important. Time and also retrocausation. I've talked with other people about potential retrocausation, and Jung's scarab story looked like it could be explained in retrocausation as something that Jung very much needed in order to support his idea about synchronicity, and provided him with a myth of Jung in bringing synchronicity to the Western world, because that he was the great man bringing the scarab, the idea of death and transformation, by presenting it to the woman, his patient. And that's a metaphor for what he was trying to do with the Western world, to bring synchronicity, bring Eastern thought into the West. And I'm part of the movement to continue to do that. So to be able to think of all of this as coming from the future, but I think it's going to be important to talk about how the effects on what we call the present influence what we would call the future. But as we talk about that, Jeff, I'm continue to ask you to elaborate on syntropy and synchronicity.
The core of that relationship is that from a syntropy entropy perspective, if you look at it in those terms, right, they're pulls from all these directions, right, or forces from all these directions, forces from the past, forces from the future. We tend to use the language of being pulled into the future and pushed from the past, but like I said, this is a language thing. But underneath it all is, if there is a purpose that you are heading towards, that's calling you forward, that's a purpose that's related to other things in the universe. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about a purpose that has no connection to anything else, right? And so there's an interconnectedness that's inherent in the picture. And now when you think about that and you start realizing that your timeline, your story is one that relates to other stories, right? Every character in your story, all the people that you know, they have their own stories, their own timelines, their own narratives, right? That are connected to you, just as yours are connected to them. And the synchronicities that are really the touch points when these different threads in the tapestry of reality, right, are coming together. These are the what feel like synchronicities when you look at this and you go, wait a minute, why is this coming together? And I would say that something that is a touch point that we think about as being driven from the past, we don't call it a synchronicity. It's just like, it's a thing. If we're both doing a thing and we come together, okay, fine, because we think about it in a causal sense. But if there are things that come together because there's a future that is influencing that meeting, that moment, that decision, that whatever it is, and I can't quite figure it out, we call that a synchronicity. And then if we look back and say, you know what, 20 years ago, this all happened, and I see where it's connected now, we see them in much greater focus, right? We can, that's the moment when this all happened. That's the synchronistic point that brought us to where we are. Whereas I would say that if we thought about it in this reverse causal, retrocausal way, we probably would think about the things that are synchronistic from that perspective would look different than the things that are synchronistic from thinking about it as a forward flowing time perspective. But there would be synchronicities regardless, those moments that came together that didn't seem to have an explanation when you had the experience, and yet in the bigger picture turned out to have significance, substantiality, importance in making the story evolve the way that it did. And that's where I think those two synchronicities and syntropy tie together.
Wow, yeah. Just take an example of meeting the right person at the right time. And that you happen to be driving through Charlottesville on the way back home after you visit your property near here. It fits together, and we call it a synchronicity. But we have trouble seeing it, and I'm starting to see what you're talking about. We have trouble seeing it as part of, you could say, a plan. How is that future thing organized? What creates that future that we are involved with? I'm not sure how to think about that, but I'm pretty sure to think about it is when I read that you are part of your purpose. Your purpose is to do something to address the challenges humanity is facing, highlighting a path to navigating toward a healthier, sustainable future. I have that in mind also as part of the Coincidence Project, and bringing synchronicity and serendipity into greater public awareness is part of it. But what you're telling me, Jeff, you devil, you're upsetting a little bit of an apple cart in my head here, because I have to now think that there's an army of us, because there's many other people. And when you describe how we're in each other's dreams, in each other's lives, we're interconnected. It's one of the ways I talk about that is, if you have a weird experience, a weird synchronicity, you can bet somebody has had, is having, or will have that same kind of experience. That's a beginning in your direction. But now here is an army of people, and I should probably use a better term than the conflict one, a cohort, a loving group or something that is moving in a direction to help alleviate the suicidal tendency of humanity. And there are many
Yeah.
people popping up. What you're saying, which is so profoundly obvious, which I didn't think about, I kind of played with it, is that we are doing this together. Some of us are being drawn to a future that requires us, that has us integrating our behavior, our intentions for ourselves and our groups with other groups that are doing something similar. And so we have to almost have confidence that this is going to keep happening as long as we keep moving. And I think we have to keep moving to make this happen.
Yeah, agreed. It's on it's another sort of synchronicity in some sense is, as I've started to be more active in networking with other people and other organizations, I'm continually astounded at how many groups are out there who have a similar idea,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Which makes perfect sense when you think, like, yeah, it couldn't have just been one or two people who really want the world to be a healthier place. So of course there are going to be people around the world who are trying to make this happen, and there are a lot of them. But it doesn't eliminate the importance of each individual one either. It's sort of like saying, well, I know I want to go get over to the fridge, but the fact is I still need both legs and my arms and the rest of me to all work together to make that happen. If pieces of it are just like, nah, forget it, I'm not doing it. It's like I can't make the overall mission work unless all the parts recognize that they're working together in order to make that happen, and that they are in fact part of the larger ecosystem, right? That we're each individually just one piece of what ultimately will make a difference in this.
Using your metaphor of going to the refrigerator, I suggest that we are cells in a collective human organism. And
Yeah.
I imagine this collective human organism, and I imagine that each of the cells is operating independently and operating interdependently with the other cells, and getting to a place where we can manage that independent, interdependent moving together is essential for the future of humanity.
Yeah.
So what is it that we have to do? But there's something about that have a missing link here, Jeff. If I want to be doing this, helping humanity survive on this planet, and you're trying to do that, um, how do we manage to be able to make that happen? And how is retrocausation influencing our working together with each other and with other people?
Yeah, fantastic questions. The metaphor, that cells in the body metaphor, is my favorite metaphor for describing all of this, especially when you see that one cell in the body that's going, mine, 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 mine. I want everything. I want to be in control. What would we think of that as one cell in our body? And yet we see this in society all the time, right? That one cell of society that's going, I want to own and control everything, and all the rest of you are going to work for me. And what would you say if one of the bacteria in your stomach decided that that was how it felt and it wanted everything? But what does that look like? Well, it probably looks a lot like cancer, actually, right? It's trying to have these negative influences. And I think where the best thing that we can do maybe towards that is to try to continue to wake up and make the other cells of this organism aware that they are in fact cells of an organism, not the totality of the organism. And that if they continue to look at themselves as the only thing, they're going to not do very well because they are independent with us, whether they like it or not. And that it's ultimately leading to the death of the overall, just like the cancer analogy would, right? If you continue to propagate this, it's not just the other cells that are going to die, you're going to die too, right? You're poisoning the whole system by being this way. And the more that we can get each individual cell to wake up and recognize this and start talking in similar language, in telling similar kinds of stories about what we want to view as success, and building up a movement of that. It helps to raise awareness and ultimately influence other people, so that one person who says, you know what, happiness is more important than money, is, well, okay, it's better than none. But one country that says, I'm going to promote gross national happiness over gross national product, that's way better. But 10 countries is still better than one, and so forth. And at some point, if you are really have some not healthy perspective on this, it's once you become in the minority, now it's that much harder to continue to sell an unhealthy story. So I think the secret to this is getting the word out there and really doing it at as young an age as possible, so people don't have to change their thinking into healthier ways of viewing the universe and their place within it. They don't have to change it, because changing your thoughts is hard. Learning it is much easier than abandoning a very unhealthy way of viewing your place in the universe. I feel like I maybe got away a little bit from the
No, no,
question.
you didn't. And
Okay.
that's why you're trying to promote books on consciousness for kids.
Yeah.
That's why you're doing that. And I hope synchronicity is in there, and syntropy is in there in those books too, because they can be explained in the simpler terms that you're talking about. So that's 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 all very, very important. And I would add to what I want to add to what you're saying, is that the cells not only need to get along with each other, but need to be able to emphasize their own particular contribution to the
Mm,
whole thing. And that ability of human minds to be able to hold together things that are similar and things that are different at the same time is difficult, but that's what we have to do. How we're part of the whole thing, and how we're separate and have something to contribute.
yeah. And that's so critical. And it's really a central theme of Nexus, where the point of the book was to illustrate that there are, whatever that axis is for you, whether it is you're more inclined to be yin versus yang, whether you are a holist versus a reductionist, whatever your axis is, right? There are points on those that are not, it's not that any one of those points is better or worse or right or wrong, but every point on every spectrum there has value, right? And it's learning to accept and value people who are different than you are, and not to try to make them the same, not to homogenize everything, but to realize that diversity is powerful, right? We want that diversity because it allows us to handle things that any one individual point on there would not be capable of handling on its own. And so to be respectful of people who are different than you, and to realize they've got something to offer.
That's a very important idea. Respect the differences and find the ways to work together. I've played enough sports, football and baseball and rugby to know how important it is to have our roles and to be able to fit them together. It's one of the values of being on a team. You begin to understand that. Unfortunately, sometimes competition and jealousy happens within teammates and between teammates, which has happened to me. And it's that has to be addressed without us having a conversation now about it now, unless you want to comment on it. We got to learn how to better get along with each other.
Yeah.
We go ahead.
We are brought up with these very I think naive and misleading ideas that the value of a person can be turned into a number, right? Well, you're better than I am. I'm better than you are. There's no worse example of this or better example of this than the IQ scores, right? Like, how intelligent are you? Well, I've got a number that you're 112 intelligent. That's crazy, right? There's all kinds of different flavors of intelligence. People who are fantastic at taking tests and are used to IQ score like questions, well, they score very well, but they can also, from a practical perspective, be some of the dumbest people you've ever come across. Why would you even think things the way that you do, right? We think that somehow you can have just one idea of better or worse. Are you a better rugby player or a worse rugby player? And somehow you've got to be on the better side of this. And there's two pieces of this that I think are leading us in this way. One is this naive idea that you can equate two people and think one is better than the other. And the second is that you feel like you are required to be better than everybody else around you, as opposed to simply being yourself, right? We are conditioned to constantly make those comparisons, probably because as kids, everybody was making those comparisons and with the probably very altruistic intent. You are so wonderful. You are the best. You are this, that, because they want to encourage and promote, but the language has given them the sense that if I am the best, well, then I got to be better than somebody else, right? I got to be the best of what? And, maybe a great interpretation of that would be you are the best you that you can be, but we don't usually go to the extent of making that clear if that is what we mean, right? So and then similarly, we do live in a culture that's founded in shame, unfortunately, right? It's bad to be wrong. It's bad to do these things, which is silly, right? Because how do we grow most? We grow most from our mistakes, right? So of course we should actually be very comfortable with the idea of being wrong, so long as we can use that in a productive way, right? It's no problem being wrong. I made a mistake there. Now I know something I didn't know before. That's wonderful. The more mistakes I make, the more I'm going to learn, the better I'm going to be at whatever it is that I'm trying to be. Fantastic. But we don't think about it that way, right? We're very shame oriented. I can't admit to my mistakes. I can't ever have acknowledged to somebody else that I was wrong or I made a mistake in some way. And if we could get past that concept of shame, right, it would take a lot of pressure off of us, that we could use that energy to better focus on improving ourselves or enjoying our lives and, making for a better experience overall for everybody.
The only failure is to fail to learn from failure.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about your book, Nexus, and how it connects to the idea of syntropy? And there it is, Nexus again. It's really fun to read this, and I have my complaints about it, and I have my really wonderfulnesses about this, and that's to be expected from a guy who plays with polarities. I mean, that's baked into the way Jeff Dunne thinks. Is that's going to be great, and it's going to be not so great, but at least depends on the reader. And I got a kick out of one of the characters, Valerie, who, well, had a lot of valor in her. She was a courageous, wacky, and powerful woman from regular Earth, our Earth, and she's so much fun, and all the stuff that she does for me. But you may find other people in the book more fun for you, because that's how this works. Different readers, different experiences. Could you talk a little bit about Nexus and how it connects with syntropy and maybe synchronicity?
Yeah, sure. So the goal of the book, as I mentioned before, was really to show that there are all these different spectra, and that you can't pick a best. So and it's interesting to note, just before I forget to say this, that as I've talked to different people who have read the book, different people have very different choices as to who their favorite characters are. Valerie's very charismatic. So a lot of people like Valerie. But every once in a while, I'll have somebody who really doesn't like hers. So one of the things, Valerie is the sort of the main focus, especially because the story starts from her perspective. And she is sort of this conflation of opposites. She is a female, but with extremely yang personality traits. She, in fact, in the original formation of the character, I said, let me take as much stereotypical male things and see how I can incorporate that into her personality. So she's not stereotypical by any stretch of the imagination at this point. But I wanted her to embody a lot of these things that we think of as stereotypically male. And the other character from the other world, the other champion, Gabriel, I did the same thing. What are the stereotypical aspects from the female perspective, and how do I incorporate that into his personality? So she's very yang, he's very yin, right? And it upsets the balance for the average reader who's like, wait a minute. But what's interesting is the way is people have had very positive reactions to the characters. And then there is a third character named Praxis, who is non-gendered and sits in the center of that gender, certainly, obviously, the gender spectrum, but also sits in the center of the yin-yang spectrum, sits in the center, in fact, of the old-young spectrum and lots of different ones, and represents sort of that center point. And in one of the points of the book is that it's not like if you could just get to the center, then you would have won, to use the language we were talking about before. The center point isn't better than any of the other points on the spectrum. It's simply different. That point gives you yet another valuable thing, right? So there are things that Praxis, as being non-gendered, for example, is able to bring to the story that the other characters can't. And that doesn't make them any better or worse. It just makes them another point on the spectrum that has something to contribute. So the story is about these two worlds, ours, which is very yang. It's very, obviously it's a patriarchal world. And this other one, which is a very yin, matriarchal world, all of these different extremes. We are a fractured, lots and lots of civilizations that don't particularly work well together. The other world is one unified world, right? It has one civilization as an organizing thing. All these different complements that are now sort of being smushed together. The two worlds are on this collision course. And the story is really the story of these two champions who have been told, hey, you, from each of their respective worlds, your job is to go meet the other champion and kill them. And as long as you come out successful, then our world is going to be able to survive this nexus. And so the story, brings them together with this intent that they're going to fight to the death, and that's it. And fortunately for the story, that they kind of in the process of this start going, wait a minute, I'm not sure an act of violence is really the right answer to how do we move things forward. So the story really becomes their quest to find solutions that aren't what they're told they're supposed to be doing. And the connection into this is that there are obviously synchronistic things that happen. For example, the whole story really starts with Valerie discovering, quite by accident, something that was hidden in her grandparents' house. How? Because she just happens to be there at the right time in a particular circumstance that allows her to find that. But turns out maybe it's not so synchronistic. And in fact, maybe aspects of the way she is, had she not been the kind of person she is, she would never have been there to do those sorts of things. It's a little tough because I don't want to go into any specific details at the risk of giving away some of the details of the story for readers. But the idea of how these synchronicities work to bring elements together, people together and other elements together, that help ultimately drive the story towards where it needs to go. And this is the syntropy aspect as well, which is we are moving towards an end purpose. And hopefully the end purpose is that we're going to not try to destroy the other half, but recognize that we should be working together. This isn't a fight against your opposite. It's a fight against yourself to recognize that you are not any better or worse than your opposite, but simply different, and that you need to sort of conquer your own ego and your own insecurities to be able to work together as part of that larger ecosystem, right? The cell that says, wait a minute, I have my place, or the body part. I'm a hand. I'm not going to try to do things that a foot does. I have my role and not try to do everybody's role.
Yeah, and somehow in your description, I could see the syntropy underneath. I didn't think of it, but how Kelly was organizing, and the voices and for Gabriel were organizing well before they knew what they were going to be doing. They had been pre-programmed. They were programmed to become the champions in each of their worlds, and not knowing that they were organized to be those, and that the purpose was what they were going purpose was be champions, and they didn't know that. And so this is the underlying syntropy that you're talking about. And we're not going to do this now, but we have to talk about how the future influences the present, but then the present influences the future, because this is a dynamic loop, unless this is too linear for me to be drawing it like this, because it's
No,
all.
exactly. It's spot on as you're describing it, right?
So there's more there, and that has synchronicity involved with this. So you're expanding my concept of synchronicity. And as we look at patterns with AI, there's somehow this syntropy has to be in there because you're doing it. And I'm glad it's you rather than these other guys I was talking about, because you're adding something that is so essential into this, a fundamental scientific, mathematically based way of thinking about how we may meet the right person at the right time. It has to do with the direction we're going. And that's a fundamental shakeup in this whole thing of, as I think about how to how to how do synchronicities take place. Well, let me ask you, as we're getting somewhat close to the end, a part of the book on page 149, every level of awareness gives rise to its own beacon or voice from that level of awareness. From basic cellular needs up through the collective consciousness on a global scale, all awareness exists in bidirectional flow of energy and information, past into the future and the future into the past. Could you comment on that?
Ooh, how much time have we got? Yeah, you know, where we think of ourselves, or when we think of ourselves, we have this idea that, like, okay, this is me. I sort of exist at some boundary here, but the truth is that the boundary was a decision at some level as to where to sort of focus my consciousness to acknowledge a level of identity. But as many people, I've certainly had times, you know, as you can imagine, for somebody like me, I've done my fair share of meditations and all the rest of that, right? But you do have experiences where that boundary ceases to be the right boundary for you, right? I'm not me, Jeff, in this form, this whatever, but I can connect to something greater, or to focus even down to smaller scales and what have you. And every one of those is a legitimate sense of self, where you can say, I am at this level and I'm connected, until you eliminate all boundaries and you say simply, I am, and it's the totality of all that is, right? That's a level of consciousness, and that consciousness has its own drivers. And as you break that down into things that are, you know, it's easy to use space and time examples of this, but galactic scales. But I don't mean to imply that there's some fundamental, you know, it's got to be spatial, right? You could say all things that have a sense of humor and all things that don't. I can divide it however you want. That each of those has a level of sort of conscious unity or coherence that has its purpose, that's entwined with other purposes, right? Those things that have sense of humor, those things that do not. One's not more important than another. But they work together in a harmony. And the things that sort of drive them to do the things that they do, drive them forward in time, if you use time as that way of telling your stories, right? They have their own purposes, their own ways of interacting with the things that are relevant to whatever they define as not them. And so it works at pretty much every scale, is what that quote was going towards. There's that interplay that you can look at these massive scales, and down to the tiniest microscopic scales. It's the same kind of patterns, that we are part of something, and we flow in that stream. Whatever size of that stream is, we're flowing along it, and hopefully moving towards what we believe is the right purpose.
Without sometimes knowing what that purpose
Yeah,
is.
most of the time without knowing.
Yeah, I think we're talking about how we know somewhat what our purpose is, but I don't know what it's going to look like. And I've read enough about futurology that it's tricky to predict the future. But what I know we can do is imagine a future. And imagining that future now is going to be informed by that future telling us what to imagine. That we are not just doing it here, but we are imagining what could be, because what could be is already there to be imagined.
Yep. And it's beautiful in that respect, because it's opening ourselves up to sort of the larger universe, the larger reality, to be more aware, and as such, more aware of what that future is, right, allows us to respond to it in more effective ways. Ultimately, I think what goes on is when you get in tune with that, you experience a whole lot less stress and anxiety as a result of that. Not to say that you eliminate uncertainty, but that you eliminate your fear of uncertainty, right?
And certainty is really fun.
Yeah,
That's part of the whole thing, is like, what's going to happen next? What's it there? And there's Jeff Dunne. So it's like it's you don't know, and that you're searching or open or know there's something you got that's going to happen. It happens, and then you go for it. Hey, Jeff, you want to do this pattern recognition thing with AI? Yeah, okay. I mean, it's so much fun to be sitting at the bank of the stream and watching the stream go by, and there's a fish. Let's see if that fish wants to come over and play with me.
yeah.
It's like it's like that. So we're getting near the end, and I still would like to get back to that quote, because what's hidden in the quote, somewhat, from at least from how you responded, is that there is a consciousness, a global consciousness, of each planet of the two Earths has a consciousness, which is manifesting in the two champions among the many other people who are on each planet. That the beacons to talk into people's heads and guide them, the voices that many of us hear that are guidance for us, those are the beacons, that the name you give beacons, and they're coming from the consciousness of the planet in the book. But aside from that, the getting the champions to come together in some form or other, which there was some conflict about from the consciousness of each planet. Tell us about how you imagine the energy and information of planetary consciousness.
Well, these planets, and whether you in the context of Nexus, when you talk about two planets, or you don't want to get into the sort of the fictional, metaphorical, let me describe this thing. So let's just talk about Earth.
Let's just talk about Earth, yeah.
Right. Earth is an ecosystem. It has its awareness, and that involves things that are massive in scale, like tectonic plates and tides and winds and all kinds of incredibly complex things. And it involves tiniest blades of grass down to the tiniest insect. These are all parts of what makes the Earth the system that it is. And by the way, not just the insects, but us, right? Who, by the way, are whatever the number is, 75% bacteria anyway, or I don't remember the exact number, but like we're mostly bacteria, folks. I hate to tell you, you're a collective. If you thought you were just one individual, you're really not, right? Like you are mostly bacteria. But all of these things, they do work together in some system, and sometimes in very sensible, healthy ways, sometimes self-destructive ways. Humanity being, unfortunately, a very good example of that at times. But we really do exist as part of a large system, and that large system as a whole has its, has life. It exhibits all the properties, right, that in their own form do the things that we do. We breathe. The Earth has its equivalent of breathing. It's in, it's out. It doesn't exist independent of the rest of the universe, right? Earth without sunlight, very different place, right? We have all these kind of properties that work together. And you can see the patterns of those, right? This is far from Jeff's wisdom. I mean, people have been talking about, as above, so below for however many thousands of years. Those patterns are there. And the question is, can you pay attention to them, recognize them, that these are meaningful patterns and that you have a place in those patterns? And if you are fighting to resist the pattern, you're probably going to have a much more difficult time of it, as opposed to recognizing and enjoying your place in the overall pattern. It's not to say that you don't get to have some influence on it. Yeah, everybody will influence those patterns.
Well,
That's yeah.
I call this Earth, the consciousness of Earth, the psychosphere, our mental atmosphere that we share with other sentient beings, which could include rocks going kind of slowly, but that we put in and we put it out. Energy and information, like breathing, goes in and out. We get it, we send it out.
Yeah.
And I want, this is a very important idea to the way I'm thinking about things. And when I saw it mentioned indirectly or kind of directly in that section, I said, well, okay, Jeff is thinking about consciousness, or I'll say a mental atmosphere, or the noosphere, as others have called it. So and you're very dynamic in the sense that things interact. The future interacts with the present interacts with the future, and you just showed some more dynamic patterns that you like. I mean, your thinking is this influencing each other thing. You've got that fundamentally in your mind. Not as strongly, I don't have it as strongly, but I have it. So how do our individual minds and our groups interact with this global consciousness is what I have been looking at. And I suggest that telepathy takes place in this psychosphere, and have a model for how that might work. And there are other ways of thinking about this, but I'm trying, since I saw that in your book, I wanted to say, Jeff, it looks something like what I'm trying to elaborate on.
Yeah, I think we are very much talking about the same thing. The idea of, that we are interacting, we're getting that information, we're sending that information is really central to all of this. And, sometimes we don't necessarily recognize the things that we do. For example, that the idea of telepathy, for example, which people, can't be, well, really, do you think it's really that implausible that we're getting ideas? Isn't it possible that inspiration that we get is really a connection to other things that are out there that have some kind of communication channel? Because there's lots of evidence for that, right? The Sheldrake's morphic field, or I think I'm getting the term right. Like you get a group of monkeys on this continent who all of a sudden come up with something, and then poof, monkeys everywhere are doing it for no, come on, like, is, yes, it's inspiration, but surely there's evidence to think that there is a connectedness of all these things for which this information is flowing. And what is that? For me, I think a lot about what is the nature of consciousness and what is the nature of perception. And perception to me is sort of where you reach out at whatever that kind of thing is that consciousness is, and touch, in whatever way that means, other consciousnesses, other things that are out there. You put that connection. And some of those connections can be very ephemeral, and some of them can be life-changingly powerful, depending on the nature of and the instance of the connection. And those connections can happen across time. Since time's just the way we organize it, then there's no real limit on where we're going to connect in that time spectrum or space spectrum or species spectrum, anything like that.
Well, we're going to talk, you and I are going to talk more about that, what I call the psychosphere and our interaction with it, because there's a lot to it. I'm working with a YouTube producer who has called the Intuitionist, and we're going to create a YouTube video on the psychosphere. He's very much into it. I've sent him some of my ideas about it, so we get some visuals about this dynamic between individual minds and the psychosphere, and individual minds and other minds through the psychosphere, because there's a lot of activity going on around in there, and how all that relates to the syntropy is part of the fun of this, because we're putting a puzzle together here. There's this other thing, this information energy floating around in our mental atmosphere, and there's a future, and there's a dynamic this way, and there's a dynamic this way, up and down and sideways if you do time, which we still are stuck with. So we'll talk about that some more, but we've come to the end of our time together here, Jeff, and why don't you end with some kind of Jeffreyism, which I'm sure you have a zillion of.
I'm not sure that I do.
Oh.
I think the spirit that or the sentiment that I would end with is, whatever it is that we want to do is limited more than anything else by our confidence that we have the capacity to do that. I hear people talk about things that are, I'll start with the most sort of traditional and move to others. Oh, I can't play the piano. Well, you can, if you focus on playing the piano, and the more you focus on playing the piano, the better you're going to be at it. Oh, how can I be more creative? Practice being creative, right? How can I start seeing things differently? Practice seeing things differently, right? It's not that one person can do it and another person can't. It's that another person is doing it and the other person isn't. These things develop as you focus on it. Where your focus goes, your capabilities and your nature follows. In this conversation, we talked about time a great deal, and I will say that I started being very active in trying to think outside the boundaries of traditional time that I grew up with. And over the past 5 years, I found it increased. It was very difficult to begin with, because I'm trapped by language and everything else. And over time, I have found it get easier and easier, and I'm more able to recognize when I'm getting trapped into the idea of an assumption as a reality, and not, oh, wait a minute, maybe that's not the way it is. And so I would just say, everything points to the idea that our attention is the most important investment we can make. And where we put that is going to dictate what we experience in the world, and ultimately what we grow into being. So invest it wisely.
And social media and television are trying to steal our attention.
Oh yeah.
And also our imagination.
That's what they sell, right? We are the product. Our attention is the product that they are getting very rich off of.
That's our attention. Yes. Yes. Our attention. And as our attention gets absorbed in there as products of them, our imagination goes down the tubes as well. And attention can lead to imagination of our own. And so there's a fight now for the human imagination, as human attention, and with that human imagination. So thank you very much for being with me and with us today, Jeff.
Thank you. Fantastic conversation. So enjoyable. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. We'll be talking some more. Thank you, Jeff.
Wonderful.
This psychosphere is our mental atmosphere, like a hologram of cosmic consciousness.